The snow fell gently that night. So patient, almost respectful. It covered the iron gates, the marble statues, the long private road leading to the estate, an estate the underworld whispered about but never approached. Inside those walls lived a man whose name never needed to be spoken twice. A man who had buried rivals, rewritten alliances, and survived betrayals that would have shattered empires. Tonight, however, there was no war. No shouting. No gunfire. No blood. Only dinner. A long table glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Polished silverware. Expensive wine. Laughter that sounded practiced rather than genuine. Christmas music played quietly in the background, low enough not to offend, loud enough to pretend everything was normal. This was the illusion. At the head of the table sat the boss. Still watching. He didn't eat much. He never did. Power had long ago replaced appetite. While others lifted glasses and exchanged polite smiles, his eyes moved slowly from face to face, counting breaths, reading posture, measuring silence. He noticed things others missed. The way one lieutenant laughed a second too late. The way another avoided eye contact when the wine was poured. The way the head of security stood closer to the wall than usual, his hand never leaving his jacket. This wasn't fear. It was restraint. And restraint always meant something was being hidden. The boss leaned back slightly, listening to the clink of cutlery, the crackle of the fireplace. On nights like this, decades ago, he would have enjoyed the moment. Back when peace felt earned. Back when holidays didn't feel like rehearsals for survival. Now, peace was suspicious. He glanced down the table. Someone was missing. Not a guest. Not a capo. Not family. Someone no one else would dare mention. The staff moved carefully, almost nervously, as if afraid of making noise. Plates were replaced too quickly. Glasses refilled before they were empty. Everything was efficient. Too efficient. The boss finally spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just enough to stop the room from breathing. Where is she? No name. None was needed. The music seemed louder suddenly. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clattered against porcelain. The head of security stiffened. The pause. Then an answer, quick, polished, useless. She asked to step outside, sir. Just for a moment. The boss didn't respond. He stood. The room froze. No one followed. No one dared. As he walked toward the side corridor, the warmth of the dining room faded behind him. The air grew colder. Quieter. His footsteps echoed against stone floors as memories crept in uninvited, of winters spent hungry, of men who froze because no one cared enough to notice. Of lessons learned early, weakness invites cruelty, and cruelty spreads when it goes unchecked. He reached the back door. It was slightly open. That alone was a violation. Cold air spilled inside, carrying the smell of snow, and something else. Something wrong. He stepped out. The night swallowed him. The estate grounds stretched wide and silent, white under moonlight. At first glance, everything looked untouched. Peaceful. Beautiful. Then he saw it. Near the edge of the garden path. A shape in the snow. Still. Too still. He stopped walking. For a long moment, the most powerful man in the underworld simply stood there, staring. Not because he was afraid, but because his mind was already calculating consequences. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't negligence. This was a message. Someone, somewhere inside his empire, had decided that certain lives didn't matter. That some people could be erased quietly, without permission, without consequence. That was dangerous. The boss knelt slowly, the cold biting through his clothes. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A shift so subtle it would go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know him well. Anger was easy. Rage was familiar. But what rose in him now was colder. More precise. Inside the house, laughter resumed, forced, fragile, unaware that the night had already crossed a line it could never uncross. The boss stood again and looked back toward the warm glow of the dining room windows. Every person inside believed the danger was outside. They were wrong. Because the dinner wasn't over. And whatever had just been uncovered, was about to test whether fear still ruled his empire, or whether something far more dangerous was about to take its place. The cold had a way of clarifying things. As the boss stood there in the snow, breath rising in slow clouds, the world felt stripped down to its essentials: truth, consequence, and choice. No titles. No rituals. No protection. Just reality. He didn't touch her at first. He had learned long ago that the dead told their stories best when not disturbed. The snow around her wasn't pristine. There were signs, scuffed footprints, dragged marks half hidden beneath the fresh fall. Careful movements. Controlled movements. Whoever had done this hadn't panicked. That disturbed him more than violence ever could. This wasn't the work of a reckless soldier or a drunkard. This was intention. He straightened and scanned the grounds. Cameras were mounted along the walls, their red lights blinking steadily. Security was layered here, overlapping, redundant, expensive. Nothing happened on this estate without permission, or belief that permission wouldn't be questioned. Inside his head, patterns began to crack. For years, the boss had run his empire on a simple principle: fear kept the system clean. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone knew the price of breaking them. Cruelty was not forbidden, but it was regulated, directed, controlled. Random suffering created chaos. Chaos attracted attention, and attention killed empires. Yet here she was, frozen, abandoned, written off as invisible, which meant someone believed the rules had changed. He felt it then, not grief, not sadness, but something far more dangerous. The boss rose and turned back toward the house. His steps were measured, his face unreadable. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how his shoulders had stiffened, how his jaw no longer relaxed between breaths. He entered through the service corridor. Warmth rushed at him, artificial and offensive. Voices echoed from the dining room, laughter still clinging to its script. No one stopped him. No one spoke. They all felt it. Something had shifted. He didn't go back to the table. Instead, he walked deeper into the house, past framed photographs of men long dead, partners, enemies, both. Each had fallen because they misunderstood power, because they assumed they knew where the lines were. He stopped outside a small security room. Inside, two men stood abruptly when they saw him. Their faces drained of color. "Show me tonight's footage," the boss said calmly. No accusations. No threats. That was worse. The screen flickered to life. Multiple camera angles appeared. The estate grounds. The corridors. The gates. Time rewound. Minutes passed in silence as images rolled by. The pause. The boss leaned in slightly. A figure escorting her toward the backgrounds. Not forcing. Guiding. A hand on her arm, firm, familiar. Someone she trusted. Someone authorized. The boss felt a slow tightening in his chest. "Who cleared this?" he asked. One of the guards swallowed. "It didn't need clearance, sir. He's exempt." Exempt. A word reserved for men who believed they were untouchable. The boss straightened. In that moment, the discovery deepened, not just of what had happened, but of what his empire had become while he wasn't looking. Systems had grown comfortable. Authority had become assumption. And somewhere along the way, fear had been replaced with entitlement. That was rot. And rot spread quietly. He dismissed the guards with a wave of his hand. They left quickly, grateful for survival, unaware they had just been measured and found lacking. Alone, the boss stared at the frozen frame on the screen. The past crept in uninvited. He remembered being young, powerless, watching men justify cruelty because no one stopped them. Because someone higher up decided it wasn't worth the trouble. He had sworn never to be that man. Yet here he was, presiding over an empire where suffering could happen without his name attached to it. That was the real betrayal. Not of loyalty, but of legacy. Footsteps echoed behind him. One of his most trusted lieutenants entered, careful not to speak too soon. The kind of man who knew when silence was safer than questions. "She shouldn't have been there," the lieutenant said finally. "But making noise about it could send the wrong signal." The boss turned slowly. "Which signal?" he asked. "That mercy is weakness." The words hung heavy in the air. The boss studied him, not as a friend, not as a subordinate, but as a variable. He realized then that this incident had already divided the room. Some feared his wrath. Others were testing it. And testing always preceded rebellion. The boss turned back to the screen and shut it off. "Go back to the table," he said quietly. "Tell them dinner will continue." The lieutenant hesitated. "And the one responsible?" The boss didn't answer immediately. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying evidence, hiding mistakes, pretending nothing had changed. Finally he spoke. "Whoever believed this was acceptable," he said, voice low and steady, "has already misunderstood me." The lieutenant nodded and left. The boss remained alone in the dark room, the weight of a choice pressing in. Because tonight was no longer about punishment. It was about revelation. Someone inside his empire believed they could act without consequence. And the most dangerous question now wasn't who did it. It was how many agreed. The estate sealed itself without a word. No gate slammed shut. No alarms blared. No orders were shouted down hallways. Yet everyone felt it. Phones lost signal. Cars were quietly redirected back into the underground garage. Guards subtly shifted positions, closing distances, narrowing exits. What had been a celebration just an hour earlier now felt like a holding cell dressed in velvet and crystal. Dinner resumed. The wine was poured again. Plates were replaced. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped when no one joined in. Conversations restarted mid-sentence, as if continuity itself could protect them. At the head of the table, the boss had returned. He sat exactly as before, hands folded, posture relaxed, expression neutral. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. But the people who mattered knew better. They watched his eyes. He wasn't looking at faces anymore. He was watching reactions. Every whisper in the room carried weight now. Every pause between words felt deliberate. The boss let the silence work for him. Silence made men reveal themselves. Noise only gave them cover. He reached for his glass and took a slow sip. Across the table, a capo shifted in his seat. A powerful man. Old school. Built his reputation on efficiency and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. The boss noted how often his gaze drifted toward the exits. Fear? Or calculation? 2 seats down, a younger lieutenant leaned back too comfortably, joking softly with the man beside him. His laughter came easily. Too easily. The boss remembered when laughter meant confidence. Now it often meant arrogance or denial. He set the glass down gently. The sound was small, but the room responded instantly. Conversations thinned. Bodies leaned inward. Even the music seemed to lower itself in respect. The boss spoke casually. "It's strange," he said, "how a house can feel crowded and empty at the same time." No one answered. They weren't meant to. He continued, tone reflective, almost nostalgic. "When I built this place, I wanted it to feel safe. Controlled. Predictable. Every man here knew his role. Every action had a reason." The pause. "Lately," he added, "I've been wondering when that stopped being true." A few eyes dropped. A few didn't. That difference mattered. The boss leaned back, scanning the table slowly, letting each man feel seen and exposed. He wasn't accusing anyone. Accusations invited defense. He was inviting interpretation. And interpretation created mistakes. He stood again, this time lifting his glass. "To family," he said. Reluctant echoes followed. Glasses clinked. The ritual completed itself. But the toast didn't end the tension. It sharpened it. As he moved away from the table once more, conversations restarted, but they were no longer shared. They fragmented into private murmurs, leaned-in confidences, quick glances over shoulders. Whispers. In the corridors beyond the dining room, the real game had already begun. Men pulled trusted allies aside, speaking in half-truths and hypotheticals. Old grudges resurfaced under the guise of concern. Questions were asked that sounded innocent but weren't. "Did you know about this? Who do you think he suspects? Do you think he's changed?" Every whisper carried a test. Every answer revealed alignment. The boss walked the halls alone, unseen but omnipresent. He didn't interrupt. He didn't confront. He listened from a distance, letting paranoia bloom naturally. Fear, when unmanaged, made men reckless. And reckless men always showed their hands. In one corner of the house, two lieutenants spoke in low voices. "He wouldn't have let this slide before," one said. "Maybe he's tired," the other replied. "Or soft." So, a word that never survived long in this world. The boss passed by without stopping. In another room, a longtime ally argued quietly with a younger enforcer, urging caution, urging patience. The enforcer dismissed him with a shrug. "The old rules don't apply anymore," he said. "Everyone knows that." Everyone. That word spread faster than any virus. The boss paused in the shadows, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. Not anger. Recognition. This wasn't about a single act of cruelty anymore. It was about perception. About belief. Somewhere along the line, his reputation had fractured into interpretations, and some of those interpretations were dangerous. He returned to his private study and closed the door. Inside, the walls were lined with relics of past victories, photographs, letters, reminders of what decisiveness once looked like. He stared at them now, not for comfort, but for calibration. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Men were choosing sides without realizing it. Some clung to the past. Others leaned toward a future that didn't include restraint. The boss knew this stage well. Empires didn't collapse from rebellion. They collapsed from conversations like these. He sat down slowly, steepling his fingers. By morning, the house would look the same. The snow would cover the tracks. The table would be cleared. The music would stop. But something irreversible had begun. Because now, the question wasn't whether someone had betrayed him. It was whether his empire still feared him enough to survive what was coming next. And fear, once questioned, never returned quietly. The boss sat alone in his study long after the house had grown quiet. Not silent, never silent, but subdued. The kind of hush that settled only when everyone was listening for something they hoped wouldn't come. The fireplace burned low, its light dancing across the walls like ghosts of old decisions. On his desk lay nothing. No reports. No weapons. No phone. Just memory. He had learned early that power wasn't measured by how loudly you spoke, but by how long people remembered the consequences of ignoring you. Tonight, those memories felt distant. He closed his eyes and let the past surface. There was a time when mercy had nearly destroyed him. Years ago, a lieutenant had betrayed him, stolen money, leaked routes, endangered lives. Everyone expected blood. The rules demanded it. But the lieutenant had begged, spoken of family, loyalty, second chances. The boss had spared him. Within 6 months, 3 men were dead. The betrayal hadn't ended, it had multiplied. Mercy, he learned then, was never free. It charged interest. And the underworld always collected. His eyes opened slowly. The problem now wasn't whether to punish someone. It was that too many people were watching to see how he would punish them. Fear worked only when it was predictable. Mercy introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty bred courage in the wrong men. A knock came at the door. So, respectful. Timed perfectly. "Enter," the boss said. An older advisor stepped inside. A man who had survived long enough to understand cycles. He didn't sit. He never did unless invited. "They're restless," the advisor said quietly. "They don't know what this means yet. That scares them." The boss nodded slightly. "And you?" The advisor hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "I'm afraid of the wrong lesson being learned." The boss studied him. "Which lesson is that?" "That cruelty is optional," the advisor replied. "Or worse, that it no longer requires permission." The words landed heavy. Because that was the heart of it. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about authority. The boss stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the snow had begun to melt under the estate lights, turning pristine white into something darker, muddied, real. "Once," the boss said, "men feared me because they knew I would act." The advisor waited. "Then they feared me because they didn't know how I would act," the boss continued. "Which do you think kept the empire alive longer?" The advisor didn't answer. Because both had. And both had failed eventually. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway beyond the door, guards changing shifts, conversations stopping mid-word when they noticed the study lights still on. Everyone was awake. Everyone was calculating. The boss turned back to the advisor. "If I show mercy tonight," he said, "what happens tomorrow?" The advisor chose his words carefully. "Tomorrow, they'll debate whether you've changed. And the next day? They'll decide whether they can afford to test it." The boss nodded. Testing always came before collapse. The advisor spoke again, softer now. "But if you act too harshly, you confirm something else." The boss raised an eyebrow. "That the empire is ruled only by fear," the advisor said. "And fear eventually looks for a replacement." That truth cut deeper than any threat. The boss dismissed the advisor with a gesture. When the door closed, he felt the isolation settle in fully. Leadership always ended this way, alone with consequences no one else would carry. He moved to the desk and opened a drawer. Inside lay a single object, a ring. Scarred. Taken from a man he had executed decades earlier, the first time he'd chosen reputation over mercy. He rolled it between his fingers. Back then, the underworld had gone silent for weeks. Peace had followed. But peace built on terror always required renewal. And renewal required blood. A voice echoed in his mind, something a rival once told him before dying. "You don't rule because they fear you," the man had said. "You rule because they believe you're inevitable." The boss exhaled slowly. Tonight, inevitability was being questioned. He returned the ring to the drawer and closed it gently. Outside, someone laughed nervously. Another voice snapped at them to be quiet. The house was fracturing into nerves and suspicion, every sound magnified by anticipation. The boss straightened his jacket. He hadn't decided yet. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because as long as he delayed, men would invent their own outcomes. They would prepare defenses. They would choose loyalties. They would make moves. He walked toward the door, stopping just short of opening it. Tomorrow, the underworld would wake up changed, whether by mercy or by terror. Either way, something would be lost. The cost was unavoidable now. The only question was who would pay it first. By midnight, no one was pretending anymore. The music had stopped. The wine sat untouched. Conversations dissolved into silence whenever footsteps passed. Even the snow outside seemed to fall more carefully, as if the night itself understood what was at stake. The boss had not returned to the table. That absence spoke louder than any order ever could. Men checked their watches without realizing it. Others adjusted jackets that didn't need adjusting. A few stared at their phones, willing them to ring, hoping for instructions, warnings, anything. Nothing came. The house existed in a state between moments. Not peace. Not violence. Suspension. Then, finally, the doors at the far end of the dining hall opened. The boss entered. No announcement. No escort. Just the quiet certainty of his presence. Conversations died instantly. Chairs stopped moving. Breathing slowed. He took his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands, exactly as he had hours earlier. But now, everyone understood. This wasn't dinner anymore. This was judgment. The boss looked around the table, meeting each gaze without expression. Some men held his eyes too long. Others couldn't meet them at all. He catalogued every reaction, every micro-expression, every failure of composure. Fear was uneven now. That told him everything. "I won't keep you long," he said at last. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. A few men straightened in relief. Others stiffened. Because calm like this never preceded forgiveness. "There's been a lot of thinking tonight," the boss continued. "A lot of talking. Some of it wise. Some of it hopeful." A subtle pause. "Hope," he said, "can be dangerous when it's misplaced." He rose slowly and began to walk the length of the table. His footsteps echoed softly against marble, each step landing like punctuation. "I built this organization so no one would ever have to guess where they stood," he said. "Rules were clear. Lines were bright. You didn't cross them, not because I was watching, but because you knew I would." He stopped behind one of the men. A powerful figure. confident earlier, sweating now. But tonight, the boss said, I learned something. He continued walking. Someone believed they could decide who mattered without my voice. No names. No accusations. The room felt smaller. That tells me two things, he went on. First, that someone misunderstood my silence. And second, that others watched it happen and waited to see what I'd do. That cut deeper than any blade. Waiting was betrayal in its purest form. The boss returned to his seat and rested his hands on the table. So, he said quietly, I made a decision. Every man leaned forward without realizing it. I won't explain it, the boss said. Explanations invite arguments. Arguments invite doubt. He nodded once toward the head of security. The man stepped forward and placed a single envelope on the table. No one moved. Inside the envelope were names, but no one could see them. By morning, the boss said, this house will be lighter. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Not because of anger, he added. Not because of revenge. His eyes hardened. But because uncertainty is poison. He stood again. Some of you will leave tonight believing you survived, he said. Others will believe they've won. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. Both would be wrong. He turned toward the exit, stopping only once more. One last thing, he said. Mercy was never weakness in this house. He looked back at them. It was a test. Then he walked out. No shots. No screams. No orders shouted into the night. Just silence. The kind of silence that followed men to their rooms. That followed them into their thoughts. That kept them awake as hours crawled by. Some packed bags. Some made calls that went unanswered. Some convinced themselves they were safe. Outside, engines would soon start. Doors would open quietly. And somewhere between darkness and dawn, decisions already set in motion would reach their targets. The snow kept falling, erasing footprints, hiding movements. By morning, the underworld would wake up changed. Names would stop being spoken. Seats would be empty. Whispers would harden into certainty. And no one would ever know exactly when the boss made his choice. Only that when he did, the entire underworld held its breath. And something never exhaled again.